Can everyone see that?
Yeah, I can.
Good. So just to preface this, this presentation, or part of the presentation, was originally done by Lee before I was a member of Lab in something like June 2015, I think it was.
Yeah, a long time ago.
So I decided when we were going to do the sort of brewing a Weissbier or Weizenbier thing, we thought we'd dig it out. And I've gone through and edited a few bits, updated a few bits, made sure the sort of links go to where they should do. And then added in a bit more, because I think originally it was particularly about let me read this properly, Hefeweizen. Is that right?
Well, I wish you changed it to Weissbier, right? Because I think the last time I gave this, I started off and it's meant to be soon Hefeweizen, but I call it Hefeweizen throughout. And now you're recording it for prosperity. I'm going to try and just say Weissbier instead.
Well, there's a difference between Weissbier and Weizenbier, because I did some research as well. This is a really good, if you're like, this is like the sort of German Ron Patterson. I think it's Andreas Krenmeier, and it's got some bonkers old German recipes converted for home brewers. So there's sort of no hop, slightly sour, low ABV beers, and then stuff as well like Austrian Horner beer. Anybody heard of a Horner beer?
No.
A Corinthian Stone beer. But yeah, so he's got a little bit of history in there, which is quite well researched, I think, and some interesting stuff in here. So it's an interesting one. It was very cheap on Amazon. I know it was given away briefly, and electronic copies of it were given away briefly as well.
Yeah, I got one on Kindle, but I didn't open it.
You should. There is some genuinely interesting stuff in there. So it's for some of the stuff, it's an interesting read. And even if you're just looking for recipes and ideas, there's some weird stuff.
Yeah, I was actually, that's a good chat, because I was thinking about Roggenbier, and I'm guessing it will be in there.
I think so. At least there's similar stuff to it. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that I've never heard of, and it goes back into the history of. I think obviously a lot of, now we all think of most German beers as lagers, pale lagers, but historically, like in Britain, where beers weren't pale, they might have been called pale ales, but they would tend to actually be made over, or the malt would be kilned over wood that would impart a smoky and darker, smoky flavour and sort of darker colour. And so a lot of the German beers came from the same place as well. So they were quite often darker historically. Anyway, sorry, I digress. So yes, Weizenbier.
So yeah, Hefe or Hefe is yeast in German, right? And Weizen Weiss is white, but is also wheat. It's got that dual terminology in German. So
that's what I was going to say, was that so one of the things mentioned in that book is that historically Weissbier could have been any beer made with a portion of white malt, which was not killed or not sort of dried over a fire. It was air dried, wouldn't last as long, so it tended to be much more expensive, but it would produce much paler beers. Whereas I think Weizen, even today, Weizen meaning wheat, must contain at least 50% wheat. Whereas I think that the Weiss beers, the white beers, could contain almost any white malt essentially, in almost any amount. So it was although they're now synonymous, historically they weren't always.
Yeah, and Luke was after a bit of history earlier. So the Reinheitsgebot came into force, I think, late 1400s. Mainly to stop some dodgy stuff being used to preserve the beer. That hops made it pure. But one of the things it did was go for barley and rule out wheat malt. And lots of rye and wheat were being used before that in Germany. And so when the Reinheitsgebot was put in, it was partly to help make sure that that wheat and rye was used for bread, and partly to make sure that the beer was pure, but mostly to stop imports of foreign muck that might have other stuff in it, right? So it was a bit protectionist. So the wheat beer was popular, or Weissbier was popular. And so what they did was they made one exemption for one brewery that was owned by a duke. And he was allowed to make Weissbier. That was in Germany. And he had the one brewery that made Weissbier, and did that until he died. Let me just check the date. And died at, I think, about the end. There you go. So that was the Duke of Degenberg, and that was in 1520. So about 4 years after the Reinheitsgebot got introduced in Bavaria. It was in for about 20 years before that. And then he died in 1600, paid lots of money to have the license to be able to legally brew Weissbier. Died in 1600 with no heirs, and so that whole license and brewery defaulted to another royal through whatever, hand-me-down rules, whatever were in view. And that guy then expanded it and said, well, we just make it in one place in the middle of nowhere in Bavaria, so now let's make it anywhere in Bavaria. And so it got really popular. It was 1/3 of the whole revenue of the state of Bavaria at one point, and actually funded the Bavarian army during the 30 Years' War. So it was particularly, important. So quite a bit of history behind it. But as it says on here, it wasn't really, it sort of faded out until, 100 years or so later. All of the beers before would have been that orangey colour that you mentioned, Luke. They wouldn't have been necessarily pale, but they would have been made with that white malt or wheat malt. But then it sort of faded out, and then Schneider brought it back into production. So they make quite a range, and their beers are a little bit more orange than the standard sort of Weissbier that you'd see. And that started in 1872 and just rebooted the whole Weiss, beer that we know today, essentially.
Yeah, so I think, obviously it mentions there when Schneider began production. So I think George Schneider was originally at another brewery and then started his own, because at that point the sort of the ability to produce Weissbier was licensed. So they had a license, and he decided, just as before one brewery's license ran out, he went off, started up Schneider Weiss, then they became sort of, the brewery it is today. Albeit they've moved location since then. But obviously they've also gone on then to they've gone on to produce a range of Weissbiers as a sort of standard one, I think it's Tap 7. And then they've got various others, including the Doppelbock strength Weizenbock Aventinus, and then an Eisbock version of that as well. I was actually quite surprised when I found out that Aventinus was first made in 1907. Wow. So it has been around quite a long time, albeit obviously Weizenbock is pretty rare. There's not too many examples of it, and I was one of the things I added on to this, which we'll cover a little bit later on, but not too much, was Dunkelweizen or Dunkelweiss, which there doesn't really seem to be much history behind it at all, other than it was kind of breweries deciding that people there are certain people, I think, that obviously liked the Weissbier and liked to drink it most of the year, and then obviously there's certain people like the sort of Dunkel at certain sort of the autumnal and winter parts of the year. So they decided to sort of put the two together, really. But I mean, historically, the Weiss beers, or a lot of the German beers, would have been a lot darker. So maybe there's a bit of that, or maybe it's just a sort of more modern invention. But certainly Weizenbock has been around for quite a while, over 100 years now.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of history with all of them, right? I mean, going back to 1700s or whatever. So what's in it? Certainly what's in a standard Weiss Hefeweizen, plenty of wheat malt. So 50% wheat malt, that goes up to about 70%. I think Franziskaner, I will have not pronounced that correctly either, but that's 70% malt. So somewhere between, so a wheat malt, so somewhere between 50 and 70 is pretty good. And then if you're making a pale one, you top it up with Pilsner malt.
Yeah, and for the, sorry, go on, Lee.
I was going to say, I think you added the next bit, so we've got to try.
Yeah, so the Dunkel Weissbier again. There's not really many examples of recipes, so I've added on a slide at the end to sort of cover a few different recipes, and I've got a couple of different ways of doing Dunkel Weissbier. But generally, you're talking about a base of pale or dark, because you can get a slightly dark, and it's not sort of roasted malt dark. It's more, I think, sort of instead of 3 or 4 EBC, it's sort of 7 or 8 EBC, so it's very slightly darker wheat malt you can get. And then it tends to be sort of adding on top some of the slightly darker base malts, so Vienna, Munich, maybe a little bit of caramel, occasionally a tiny bit of roast or roasted wheat malt. So it's a bit more open. I mean, generally you just want a little bit of toasty flavor, a bit richer. So yeah, something a bit more for the sort of, again, for the winter months than your more summery Weissbier. And then the Weizenbock is just either of those with as much malt as you can get in it, really. Sort of 8% plus ABV. Yeah, so big beers. Yeah, so. Yeah.
And you know, wheat is not is huskless. Yeah. So if you can think, if you put a lot of flour in some water, it gelatinizes up, gets quite thick, so you do run the risk of a stock mash. So some oat husks or rice hulls, 10, 15, 20% are probably a good addition if you're making that at home, just to stop that. They don't add any flavor, but they just help with that, processing it. Not much OBU, especially in the Hefeweizen, 8 to 15, and just standard noble hops. Bit more there in the dark, bit more there in the bock. Specifically, you need to use Hefeweizen wheats or Weiss yeast, and soft water. I don't know if that's any different for the bocks and the dark. You might get away with something a bit harder.
Yeah, you can go a little bit harder, particularly with the bock. But I think even the Dunkel is beneficial to having something fairly soft,
yeah,
rather than sort of, yes, the heavily sort of high calcium water that we have. So yeah, I would go down to that, start a bit lower, not quite as soft as the regular Weissbier, but not far off, if I'm honest. And the Weizenbock can probably have quite a lot more in there because it's a much bigger beer.
Yeah. And so the flavor profiles are really yeast driven. You've got softness from the wheat malt, so you do get wheat flavor, but they're pretty simple. Most of those hop additions are early, if not all of them, so they're not hoppy flavored. So you've got a soft, billowy wheat type flavor, with essentially a balance of banana and cloves that the yeast throws off. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then I guess as you're layering over some of those dark flavors and the bock, giving it a bit more rich malt.
I was also going to say, like, on the point about oat husks and rice hulls, I also found that the wheat tends, so also the wheat itself, the grain is smaller. So if you're crushing it yourself, you actually have to tighten up your mill a little bit. It's a little bit smaller than barley, I should say, and it's quite a bit harder. So you will need a bit more power in there, and if you're hand cranking it, you're going to get a workout. A few years ago, I made a 100% wheat beer, and that was a sort of 100% dark. It was sort of a darker beer. It was the idea of like, oh, let's make 100% wheat porter. I think I was inspired by. There's a recipe in the Randy Mosher book, Extreme Brew. Is it Extreme Brewing?
Yeah.
Yeah, and thought that was interesting, so I thought I'd make it. But it was a nightmare. First of all, the drill I was using, the battery ran out, and then the second battery also ran out from the strain of having to crush all this wheat malt. Then when I finally, at one point actually, the wheat was quite hard, so that I had the drill running, and something got stuck in one of the rollers, and it literally just flipped the whole grain mill over, sort of throwing a whole bunch of wheat malt all over the place. And then when I finally did actually manage to get through it, the wheat malt produced quite a bit of flour. I didn't realize this at the time, but by the time I got through got to the end of the boil, emptied out the kettle, and there was this sort of hard black crud attached to my element. And when I tasted the beer, it was like burnt beer, ashtray beer, unfortunately. And so, yeah, I think there was just a lot of flour that came through from the wheat. So since then, if I do something that's high wheat, I will use a bit of extra husk, but I'll also recirculate it quite a lot to try and catch as much of the flour as possible. Yeah, and I've not had any issues since. So yeah, helps all of that.
When I first presented this in 2015, I'm pretty sure you could only get oat husks. You couldn't get rice hulls in the UK. I think it was that way around. And one of them is used a lot for fireworks, so you couldn't import food grade ones. But I think that switched around now. So I can't remember which way around it is, but you could only get one, but all the US recipes used another. But they're essentially...
All the US ones use rice hulls, and certainly up until very recently couldn't get them in the UK. It was always oat husks.
Yeah.
But
yeah, they're used in fireworks, so that's why they
okay.
Right. But I think you can.
Can I ask a Weizenbier unrelated question about rice hulls versus oat husks for those who have used them? What I have found, again, anecdotal evidence here, is that any beer that I'm brewing with oat husks, no matter what I do, I can't get clear. And I was wondering if rice hulls don't have that effect.
The one thing I have noticed with the oat husks, and again, I don't know if it's rice hulls are the same, but they're quite dirty.
They are dirty and really dusty, and I get a lot of oat dust in there.
You rinse them off, and yeah, if you rinse them, it's like, ugh, the amount of stuff that comes off of them.
Yep.
And also then if you do that, then you sort of pre-soak them so they don't suck up as much of your precious wort.
So you could do that. You could wash them first.
Yeah. Or even if you, go on, Lukasz.
Yeah. What I do, I basically put them on a sieve and just sieve off all that stuff. It takes like 10-20 minutes, but I think it's worth it because there's so much stuff. I think in weight, probably there's half of it is just that sawdust that's in there. Yeah.
Wow.
Any experiences on rice hulls in the UK?
I've seen them on sale, but not used them yet.
Well, yeah, maybe something for me to try as well. Good, thanks.
Yes, that's what goes in terms of the process. Decoction is traditional. Rob's not here, so we can say you can probably get away with single infusion. I've only ever made it with single infusion, 67, no other rest. But actually, there is a precursor to the clove flavour, which is 4-vinyl guaiacol. And the precursor to that is ferulic acid, and you can generate that if you mash at 43 to 45 at a slightly higher pH if you want to really get technical. But as soon as I did that, the clove nature of the beers really jumps up. So I would recommend a ferulic acid rest if you're struggling to get clove flavours. And you can, and historically they did, run the protein mash at 50 just to reduce that stuck mash. But again, if you're using oats or whatever rice hulls, you can get away with that. So I made plenty of beers, and in fact the first beer I made was, I think the best, was just a single infusion. but you will get more close if you do that 43, 45 ferulic acid rest for about 10, 15 minutes. I put in there to boil for longer because there's more proteins and a higher risk of DMS from the Pilsner malt. Depends how much Pilsner malt you're putting in, but generically they suggest boiling for an hour and a half if you're using a lot of Pilsner malt.
I've never had an issue with it myself of like an hour.
Yeah.
It seems to be fine. It's like as long as it's a good strong boil for an hour, it's
I agree. I think it's probably one of those things that people have always done, not necessarily you need to do with modern malts. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to say exactly that. Modern malt seem to have removed that issue. I don't know whether it's the same with any of the sort of historic malts and things like that which are coming out now, but I've not heard any issues yet.
Yeah. But as we said earlier, most of the flavours, certainly for a standard Weissbier, are all coming from the fermentation factors, and so yeast health, yeast strength, and temperature control is really important if you want to even try and get something reproducible. And even then, my beers seem to come out quite wildly different from how I remember them before. So, these yeast forward beers, I think, are the most difficult to replicate as a home brewer. You can make them without temperature control, but you will get slightly random result. Probably be the best beer you've ever made, and you'll never get it again when you go to ferment it. But
I mean, I would say on the top point, obviously, single or double decoction is traditional. I think in some ways it's worth doing. I wouldn't go to a triple decoction. I did do it for a Weizenbock, and it was the richness you get off of it is almost, initially you taste it, it's like, good God, that's sweet, but then it's not sweet. It's just very, very rich initially, and normally those things would go together, but it just doesn't with the decoctions. But I do think that even your regular pale Weissbier is potentially worth doing a little single decoction, because I think it does add an extra richness and maltiness to it. And there's a myriad of other benefits of head retention. I know Rob did his decoction presentation a couple of months ago, so won't go over that again, but it's one worth doing as well. And as Lee said, like, I think the biggest thing about this style is getting the fermentation right, and that's why it's a tough style, or tough styles rather, to get right, because it's so easy for them to the fermentation to go not quite right, or you're not getting quite enough flavor from it, or just or you're getting the wrong flavors from it. So I move on.
Yep.
So this is the slide I added in, going across various different yeasts when sort of researching it. I think when Lee's original one, he had quite a few yeasts on it, but there's a lot more have popped up since, some of which you'll be able to get hold of, some of which you won't. So the one which a lot of people use, WLP 300, sort of good balanced clove and banana. When I've used it, I got a little bit of slight tartness from it, which again is when I think we had that in one of the beers I tried in when we were in Bamberg. So, and from what I've been told, it's not. It does occur in a lot of German, or in several German Weiss beers quite often, but we're just not used to tasting it, and it's certainly not in the style guide when we'll get to that in a minute. So have to experiment and see. The other one, which you see quite a lot of, and the one I quite like is WLP 380, which is a bit more clovey, but it does produce a bit of sulfur. And that's I made a lot of beers with it, and more have had sulfur in them that haven't, but it's something I'm determined to figure out, and how to stop it doing that, or at least get it out of the beer, because the actual flavor it produces for me is superior, more interesting than the WLP 300. There are Y yeast versions of both of that, or there's Y yeast version of WLP 380, which is Y yeast 3068. There is also White Labs 351, which is actually a mix of two yeasts, a lager yeast and a Weiss yeast. It attenuates a bit more. It has a slightly milder flavour, so could be good for your sort of Dunkel or Weizenbock particularly. There's a Weiss version of that as well. You can also get more. So most of those yeasts are not very flocculent, and that they won't clump together and drop out of the beer. They will tend to stay in suspension much longer because they've got a pleasant flavour, unlike other sort of yeasts. And so obviously the when you're saying the Hefeweizen, Hefe yeast, I think, is that right?
Yep.
So sort of normally you'd pour that all in for the extra flavour. But there are also crystal Weizens out there where the beer is either used a more flocculent yeast, or could even be filtered for a high level of clarity, but you're still getting the same sort of banana and clove character, but just to a lower level.
And I've made crystal Weizen with 300 or 380, just drops out. And I don't know, I mean, some people discuss adding a bit of flour and stuff to try and make it cloudy. Yeah. I just wouldn't bother. I couldn't tell much difference in the taste between the one that was cloudy and the crystal Weizen.
I agree. Yeah,
bottle and get it all back in if you really want. Anyway, obviously you can't necessarily do that with a keg, but yeah.
Yeah, I've had them drop very clear as well, and yeah, it doesn't massively change the flavour. I mean, it's one of the things about packaging. So modern, so those modern Hefeweizens, you'll tend to get packaged in bottles because it's much easier to dump the whole lot in, and it's also, you can carbonate it to a much higher level than in the keg. Whereas I think a keg, you're struggling to pour it when you're at sort of 3 or 3.5 volumes of CO2. It's less of a problem in the bottle. And you can also just upend the whole bottle if you want to, and dump the whole lot in. So there are sort of big advantages to bottling for there. Just finishing on the yeast, there are a few dry options. The Mangrove Jack's M20, sort of mixture of banana clove with black pepper. I think that's the same as the Mori Brew Weiss yeast as well. It's the same thing. There is also a sort of what is supposedly a dry version of WLP 300, which is Lalman Munich. And last of all, I wanted to mention Sapbrew WBO6 because I thought it was a Weissbier yeast, and I used it in a Weissbier a long time ago. Thought it was quite nice, but actually when I looked at it, it turned out that the history behind it is actually Belgian yeast. It's almost the Duvel yeast. So more for sort of Belgian golden ales and things like that, rather than a Weissbier, rather than German Weissbier. But yeah, something of interest. I think they still advertise it as wheat beer yeast. Anything else on that, Lee?
No, I mean, it's expanded a lot since I wrote this 7 years ago. So yeah,
so many more wheat beer yeast mixes and blends and things like that. One thing I didn't put on here, and I meant to mention, getting yeast out of bottles is another great way of doing it. Schneider Weiss definitely still bottle conditioned with their primary strain, and Ken Basley has managed to grow that up before successfully, and it's like provides quite a different character to anything else. So that's another source potentially. It's always difficult in that when you grow stuff up from dregs, it can go sideways and end up sort of chlorophenolic or something like that. So I would tend to sort of do a starter and then see how the starter tastes before you use it on your actual beer. But in terms of, you won't find a version of that from any of the yeast manufacturers that provide the same level of complexity. So if you can get it and you can make it work, then that's another really good way of going. Plus you get to drink a couple of great wheat beers before that. Obviously the main thing is finding fairly fresh bottles of it that have ideally been refrigerated. I've got an off license near me that usually has it on a shelf, but it's out on a shelf, not in a fridge. So I wouldn't really trust that. So yeah, that's another good option as well, getting it from there. Not all breweries do bottle with their primary strain. I think that obviously the likes of Franziskaner pretty certain doesn't. I think they use a bottling strain at best. And also coming back to your earlier point actually about adding wheat and stuff for cloudiness, Lee, I read once in one place that some of the breweries actually these days, instead of using lots of yeast in the bottle to get the haziness, they actually induce a haze by other means. So it's kind of like an artificial haze rather than a yeasty one, just because that's what people are expecting in their beer. But it's not so good shipping the beer with all the live yeast in it to sit on supermarket shelves for ages. So some of them will cause a haze by other means.
James,
yeah.
if I may ask a question, at that point you just made about this artificial creation of the haze, I've seen that product. It only seems to be available commercially, though. I've never seen it, or when I looked for it to see if you could get a small, a small amount of it, I didn't have any success. I forget what it's called, but I was interested in it for the purposes of keeping the beer hazy, because if anything, I struggle to keep wheat beers from going clear.
But it's not bringing you any of the flavor or aroma benefits of keeping it hazy. It's just a purely visual thing of customers expect the beer to be hazy, but when it's sat on the supermarket shelf for 6 months, it's not going to be hazy, or it's the yeast that was in it has been baked and has given off flavors. So
well,
I'm trying to remember the method by which they did the haziness. It was like
likewise for a competition beer, no one's gonna. You have no means of saying pour it mit Hefe, like that sort of stuff, do you?
No.
It'll get poured, and it's going to be the look at the draw as to how it's.
It's a bugbear of mine in the Bjcb guidelines that you don't nominate how it should be poured.
I mean, the flip side is you don't want to let it hang around to clear anyway. Ideally, right? It's wheat beer, so it goes off pretty quick. So drink it quicker. And it is one of those ones, if you're putting it in a competition, that you're better off planning to make it and just be shoving it in. I mean, I've made wheat beers and I'm drinking them a week after I've pitched. If you can carb them up quick, pretty quick fermentation, fizz it up, and it's going off from that point. So this was one of the ones that, for me, was you give as much away as you can and get people to give you some more long aging ones.
What yeast do you prefer then for that sort of thing, Lee?
I think the 3068 rings a bell. Let me look in the fridge, see what I've kept.
I suppose when you send your beers off, you're going to put them in a box saying this side up and put them in upside down.
Years ago, I went to a beer festival and went to I think it was the Bjcb Beer Festival, and they had a fridge there for non-British beers and a bar there, and spoke to like the German guy there, and we started going through the wheat beers, and he had like one that literally the label wasn't upside down intentionally, saying like the point is you do this with it.
I like 3068. They didn't have it, so I bought 300. I think they're interchangeable, right? I think they're pretty much known as being the same thing, so I do interchange them, but I have a slight preference for Y yeast smack packs over White Labs. So
me too. In my research, so I thought that 3068 was meant to be the same as 300, but I've finding some evidence that it's actually might be nearer to 380. But yeah, more and more I look at, it's like the beer, the yeast that are supposedly the same from different manufacturers tend not to be. They tend to be something that they think is close to it.
I made my first Weizenbier and it was perfect, and I've been chasing that dragon ever since, and that was with 3068, and I think I have tried another yeast, didn't like it, and have just gone back to 3068, but I've not managed to recreate the pleasure that I had in my first beer. whether that was misplaced or not, I'm not sure.
Maybe it's a good style to just blend the yeasts, like have the 300 and 380 or something together to get that sort of complexity.
I mean, it is very yeast driven, so you've got some randomness in pitching. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but yeah, it's very hard to reproduce this beer.
James,
Let's
which of
talk about
those yeast did you say was chucking out the sulfur?
380.
You wanted to get rid of? Was that the 380?
Yeah, 380. I've used it a lot, and I've won rosettes with it, but equally I've had horror beers that just smell of rotten eggs from it. And yeah, I'm trying to figure out why. So we'll see. I've used it many times, and it seems to be a bit random, but I'll yeah.
Oh, you were interested in something I posted a bit ago, where I was bubbling CO2 through the dip tube in order to get rid of a whiff. I'm convinced in that what I did there did something, because I did it again. As to whether if it's really horrible whiffy, probably not, but there's a notable difference in doing that.
Cool.
Bent it off.
It was an odd one. Hey ho.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeast forward beer, it's all about fermentation, pitch rate, etc. And basically what you're trying to do is balance the clove and banana output. Your most important variable is that yeast strain. And then you have the ferulic acid rest, and then pitch rates and fermentation temperature will all play significant parts. Some people talk about underpitching and overpitching for this and other styles. I'm not a fan of that because it's random. So I always think if you want to make something and have any chance of reproducing it, pitch what you think is the right amount. Don't under or over pitch, because that will vary quite a bit. But basically, if you want banana, then that comes from an ester. So fermentation temperature, it's going to drive esters. So the higher you ferment, the higher temperature you ferment, the more banana you will get. And flip side of that is, if you want clove, then ideally do a ferulic acid rest to give lots of precursors to the 4VG to come through. And you can then lower the fermentation temperature. So when I jumped from messing around with fermentation temperatures and trying to drive more clove and going lower and lower in fermentation, not quite getting there, and then stuck at that temperature and stuck a ferulic acid rest in, there was loads and loads of clove. I mean, it was basically positively spicy. So if you are messing around with fermentation temperature, but you're not doing a ferulic acid rest, and you add that in, it's going to change it significantly. So if you stick a ferulic acid rest in, I'd suggest going up a couple of degrees to compensate from that. But it's going to completely depend on your equipment, where that balance is. So this is quite a nice one to try and fine tune in your brewery. You're probably going to be making it, if you make it once a year, it's a nice summer. It is a refreshing drink, Serge, but we'll come on. You can argue the point on that. Yeah, this used to be one of my standard summer brews, probably replaced with Grodzisky for a bit. Again, I'll have hashed that pronunciation up, Lucas. But there's plenty to play around with and quite difficult to reproduce. But if you can start making something, it's interesting to try and then have a go.
Yeah, I think the much higher end of things on temperature wise, you can end up with strawberry bubblegum as the flavor rather than necessarily banana. So be careful about sort of really ramping up the temperature. But yeah, so I one of the things I'm going to explore is around sort of pitch rate. Historically, I've not underpitched it, but I've not oxygenated it sometimes. So I wonder whether I'm going to go back to basics and say, let's do a regular fermentation with it, as I normally would with other ale yeasts, and see how that goes. See if that knocks the sulfur out or something.
Banana's easy. It's the clove that's more difficult. And you can make quite a few beers and think you've got the clove, and then when you put the ferulic acid rest in, you're like, oh, now I've really got the clove. So and if you're a judge and you judge these, you'll realise how different they can be. So it is quite interesting to play around with that.
And obviously, when you're making the darker ones as well, you might want to tone down some of these, the clove and banana a bit, just so you've got a bit of it that doesn't clash too much with the malt flavours you're getting through. Depends what you're making.
So, question on that then. Do you tone them both down, or do you tone one down preferentially when you're using darker stuff?
Well, the one thing of the going back to the yeast that was a mixture of Weiss and lager, I think one person I saw suggested that as one way of getting there. But I don't know, basically. We'll see. The one thing I do know is that, again, a few years ago, I made, and I brought it to the lab in December for the Extreme Beer Meet. I made a 100% smoked malt beer that was a wheat beer. So it was sort of 60% smoked wheat malt and 40% smoked or Rauch malt. I made it with the, I think, WLP 300, and the level of the phenols from the smoke and the phenols from the yeast sort of clashed a bit. So it was interesting, but it was not Schlenkerla's Weizenbier. I don't know whether they even use a Hefeweizen yeast, or they use just a regular one, and sort of with a. I'm trying to remember what we tasted in when we went there.
I have had a smoked Hefeweizen in a homebrew, or some homebrewer sent me. Quite nice at low levels, but yeah, there's plenty to play around with. Phenols versus banana.
It's adding in another sort of difficulty into it all. So I think I probably want to go back to make it a good Weiss beer, and then maybe start playing with levels of smoke.
I'd imagine accentuating the clove spiciness probably gets lost and is nicer in the darker beers, and dropping the banana. But
well, that's the thing. It wasn't a bad beer. It was just a bit odd. It was just like there was nothing technically wrong with it. No sulfur or anything like that. There was nothing that was like gross. It was just a bit of an odd flavor clash. I mean, I think Mark Charlwood described it as like having I think he said like a cola cube wrapped in bacon or something like that, or a pineapple cube wrapped in bacon. So it was just an odd thing to put together for some reason. So yeah, there you go.
Okay.
All right. What we got next? Ooh, there we go. Bjcb Guidelines. I've updated them to the 2021 guidelines, so not greatly different, if I'm honest. They've largely stayed the same, with a few words here and there that have changed.
I'm looking desperately for the refreshing word to get.
There you go. It's the third word, refreshing.
Where? Oh, there you go. See,
Pale refreshing.
Third word in Serge. It's refreshing.
Yeah, but we know that BJCP has it wrong quite often, and this is probably one of them.
You're saying it's not refreshing?
I don't like. I enjoy it, but I don't find it. I would never describe it as refreshing.
Wow.
I don't know why, but that's just my personal viewpoint on that.
Wow, I love it. It's good lawnmower beer.
Oh, I love it. I will drink quite a few pints of it. Refreshing, it is not.
Refreshability from low to high would be maybe how they'd describe it now.
Yeah, I would be okay with that.
I guess mouthfeel might be interesting. So it's very highly carbonated. I think we alluded to that earlier, James. So yeah, it's one of those ones where if you're going to put it in bottles, shine a torch through the bottle, make sure it doesn't have any defects in, because this is going to be one of the highest carbonation that you have, 3.5, and or grab some extra beer line if you're going to be serving it from a tap. And then it has a very, very soft, billowy head. So there is a special glass, I think on the first slide, that sort of tapers in at the bottom, comes out a little bit, but quite long, almost like a Pilsner glass that just comes out a bit of the top and closes in, so you should get lots of head. It's very spritzy, so you get a bit of carbonation from that, and then this sort of wheat softness coming through, and then, like I say, you know, wheat flavors, banana, clove as a balance. The Weizenstefana, I probably said that wrong, is pretty easy to find. Franziskaner, which is the 70-75% wheat one, is pretty much in all the supermarkets. One of the BJCP exams I put in, I can't remember if it was Aldi or Lidl beer, and told the guy, you know, beforehand, look, this is probably going to be a pretty rubbish Hefeweizen. Everyone scored it mid-40s and loved it. So
we had the, I think it was the Aldi wheat beer on the most recent exam that I was proctoring.
It was a Rheinbacher Weizenbier.
It was quite watery and clovey, and yeah, it was okay. It was kind of like technically well made, just somewhere between a bit dull and just a bit sort of not greatly well balanced, if I'm honest.
I think what we can take from that is the Aldi and Lidl beers might be good and they might not, but they'll all be
highly variable.
The Schneiders are a little bit out on their own. Franziskaner is a pretty solid example of the style, right? But the Weizenstefana is really, really good, and they do a crystal Weizen as well, don't they? With the blue label.
The Schneider Weiss takes a bit more finding, but I think it's worth it. The Franziskaner I think is a bit boring. It's okay. The Weizenstefana is somewhere in between.
You got to be careful with the Schneider Weiss. What was the one I had in?
You had the Hopfenweiss, which was a sort of Bock strength hoppy like IPA.
11 a.m. Did I?
It's a great beer. That again, you need ideally you need it fresh. But yeah, that's a very hoppy. That's Weizenbock, but a pale version of it really. Very, very hoppy.
But there is a hoppy version. I don't think we talked about that. I mean, Hopfenweiss is Weiss beer with loads of hops in later on.
Yeah. I quite like the Iyengar Weiss beers as well, but they're very difficult to find. I like the pale one, and I like the dark one even more, but that one is very difficult to get a hold of these days.
And then in pubs you get, is Edelweiss, I think it's Edelweiss is a white beer, right? I sometimes get that. I've had that snowboarding quite a few times.
Does anybody remember like years and years ago, like Kronenberg had a white beer?
I remember it.
Yeah,
it was like a rip-off of that was more like a Belgian wit.
Okay.
I thought.
Okay.
All right. So Dunkel Weiss beer, similar to the pale, just a bit more in the way of sort of bready or caramel flavors. You still have the yeast notes, still have the high carbonation. Most of the statistics are very similar. You can go ever so slightly higher on the gravity and the overall ABV and the bitterness as well, but it's a very small difference. It's not a big way. Most of the other things apply really. It's just you're getting a bit more bread, a bit more caramel. It's kind of like the wholemeal bread versus the sort of white bread of the pale Weiss beer. So it's just got that little bit more to it, but it's very similar beer otherwise. The only difficulty is actually finding it anywhere. Weizenstefana do one, and you do actually see it fairly regularly in supermarkets. There is, and again, my favorite there is the Urweiss from Iyengar. Franz kind of do one. I don't know if I've seen it around, but they're quite rare to get hold of. But otherwise, it's largely the same or very similar sort of sensation and flavor and aroma, just with a bit more malt, bit more caramel. Yeah,
I never got this style because it loses that refreshingness when it goes a bit darker. But until I had there was a really good homebrew version or something that I had, and then kind of understood it. But yeah, it's kind of.
But it's more for like it's
weird.
more where if it's less of a lawnmower beer and more of a sort of autumnal, it's getting a bit cooler. When if you like your wheat beer and then you just want sort of something a bit richer in the winter, really, and through that time of year.
But they call it like an old man's beer in German.
It is these days, yes, very much just like an old person's beer.
I'm personally a huge fan of this particular variation of a Weissbier. I've attempted to brew it twice, didn't quite work out, but I've had the Wachenstefana Hefeweißbier Dunkel quite a few times, and I just really like the beer, and it's fairly easy to find. Like some bottle shops stock it fairly regularly.
Just thinking aloud here, but like, has anyone tried banana with a bit of clove powder on, spread on toast? Because that sounds like what this might be. I'm gonna go inside, get some bananas out of them.
I've got some rye bread, so I think I'll combine the three.
Yeah.
You go and do that. I'll talk through Weizenbock then. So this is the strongest one. So you already mentioned you can go pale, you can go dark with it. I mean, it's taking either of the others and then increasing the strength up to sort of Bock or Doppelbock strength. So you're talking sort of 6.5 to 9% ABV. Again, I've got the IBUs wrong in there. That should say I think about 15 to 30. Sorry, I didn't update this entirely correctly. You get a slightly higher finishing gravity, so they are quite a bit sweeter in the finish, and obviously the starting gravity is a lot higher. They're going to be, again, I mean, all of these beers are medium to full bodied. So although it's refreshing, the initial impression is quite full bodied, and that's a combination of the wheatiness and the high carbonation. These you'll also then get you'll get the sort of alcohol warmth as well. This is meant to be a complex wintry beer, again with a lot of malty richness. Again, worth sort of double decocting it, but malty richness combined with an interesting profile from the yeast as well. And because you're doing so much more with it, you can get a lot more. There's a lot more in the way of flavors from it. You can get away with a lot more out of it as well, I think. As long as it's not sort of faulty like sulfur or something like that, or hot alcohols, or sourness. These can be light, and which are the paler ones tend to be quite rare actually. I did have an example down there. Yeah, so there's an Eyinger one which is pale, but more commonly they tend to be dark ones. So they'll have a bit more in the way of dark fruit, prune, that sort of thing, cherry, and much more sort of intense Maillard-y products you've got from the grain, and potentially from you're doing a decoction. So just basically bigger beers, but you still want it to be nicely balanced. And and of course, on top of that, if you really want to, there is the Eisbock version of this that Schneider Weiss do, where they take the Weizenbock of Entinus and then freeze distill it, so it goes up to well over 10% strength, and that's very nice beer. I tend to have one myself around Christmas, and yeah, really special beer. That not an everyday beer though.
So wait, is Weizenbock an ale then? Because I always thought is it a Bock or is it a Weizenbier?
Well, Bock just means strong, really.
Okay, because I was thinking it was like a lager, like a strong.
No. So it's a strong wheat, really.
Okay, so it is like a Weissbier, but a strong Weissbier.
Stronger, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh right, okay, interesting.
So they've just taken Weizen and then make it strong like a Bock.
Yeah, okay.
Or Doppelbock. So obviously Lee's already mentioned that you had the sort of hoppy versions as well, and that's again like near up to doppelbock strength, but a lovely beer.
Have you seen them cloudy then? Because I suppose when I picture
Yeah.
one, I think it was being clear, but they're cloudy.
No, they can be. I mean, said more often they're dark, like down to sort of mahogany kind of color darkness. So you won't always know, but certainly the hop from Weiss was cloudy. So yeah, I mean they're as much yeast driven as the more sessionable strength ones.
Wow.
They're just much stronger.
Well, it's interesting, yeah, because a strong beer, I suppose, is the same challenge you have with a triple IPA, because it's like with a strong beer, you generally want to age it, but with a Weiss beer, you want it to be young. So imagine with this, maybe it's like a month old. You want to sort of make it as young as possible, but it's no hot alcohol. So I can imagine maybe you brew it and then maybe you wait a month and then it's good, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully you don't get any hot alcohols in the first place from your fermentation. So it should be relatively fresh when you drink it. It shouldn't need much in the way of aging. But that's part of the skill and difficulty of brewing it. It's one of the most complex beers you can brew, probably.
Cool, thanks.
So I thought it would be good to share a few recipes, certainly ones I've done over the years. So just as some examples, so in the top left here, I have just a pale Weiss beer I did, that one of the ones with WP380 that didn't have a lot of sulfur in it, that came second at BrewCon in 2018. That was made up with 55% Wyman pale malt, 55% Wyman pale wheat malt, 44% Pilsner malt, and 1% melanoidin malt. This beer I didn't decoct. It was had a 4VG rest at 45 degrees for 10 minutes, and then they then went on to the main saccharification rest for 60 minutes at 65 degrees. Relatively low level of IBUs, 11 IBUs from noble hops, and then WLP 380 fermented at 17 degrees, pretty much to finish. So the original gravity was 1049, the final gravity of 1011. I'm a big fan of keeping the malt profiles fairly simple these days. And I mentioned earlier, and I think this one wasn't decocted, but I think you can get the melanoidin character from decocting instead if you wanted to. Lee, what's your sort of recipes? What do they look like for a pale wheat beer?
Yeah, I think probably 60-70% wheat. Pilsner malt. I don't use the melanoidin. They do a light melanoidin nowadays. I don't know. I just always felt that.
Well, that light melanoidin is similar to the Dingerman's aromatic malt. So aromatic is more like a sort of Vienna,
Right.
whereas melanoidin is more of a Munich, I think, is the difference. So they're slightly different in terms of the colours and strengths of them.
I kind of think that'll clash a bit. I'm kind of trying to keep mine light, so I wouldn't do that. 3068, and then my favourite noble hops, Mittelfrüh, the best one. Sars, close second.
Cool. Just going down to the bottom right here, I sort of see quite a lot of recipes for Dunkelweizen that include a mixture of darker malts as well as some special B seems to be fairly common, and even some roasted or chocolate wheat. Slightly more bitterness, but again, similar sort of yeast, 300, 380, slightly stronger. So you'll see chocolate wheat, or you can find roasted wheat, same sort of thing. It's about 800 EBC. But yeah, special B is the interesting thing, particularly at 5%. Quite fruity. I've not made this. I'm interesting. But certainly I've seen that as an award-winning recipe in BJCB competitions at quite a high level as well. So who knows?
That special B doesn't mess about. I mean, it's proper
No.
racy, and you know, it's quite. I'm taken aback at that.
Yeah, it seemed a lot to me. So what I am going to brew, and you'll probably see in August, unless it all goes wrong, I've gone down a much simpler route of taking the Wyman dark wheat malt, 60%, and 40% of the Wyman Munich 2, which is slightly darker Munich, and I'm going to do a double decoction, and otherwise it's fairly similar. So I'm trying to start a bit simpler, and use the slightly darker malts and get a bit more color from decoction is my idea, rather than using the sort of roastier malts and special B, which I kind of feel might be a bit overpowering, but obviously I've not tried it, so we'll see.
Okay.
And then the other one which I have brewed was a dark Weizenbock, which was a second at BrewCon in 2017. And this is where I have used some of the chocolate wheat, but then also, so yes, it was 41% pale wheat malt, 33% Vienna, 10% dark wheat. I don't know why I did that, but it's a few years ago. And then, 7% of the Dingemans aromatic, which I understand is kind of more of a Vienna melanoidin. 7% caraway wheat, so that's a caramel wheat malt, crystal wheat malt kind of thing. And 2% chocolate wheat, which is a roasted wheat malt. This was triple decocted, and had slightly more bitterness in it, and then used my favorite WP 380. The one thing I would say is that it did come across, initial taste was quite sweet, but it did settle down. But the malt character and everything from it was fantastic. So definitely one I need to rebrew at some point soon. Perhaps I'll use the yeast from the dunkel and go on and brew it straight after. We'll see. Any questions on any of those? No? Cool. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it.
Quick question for you. You just mentioned there you want to go and make a rebrew using the yeast.
Yeah.
What's the general thought about reuse of?
I do it all the time.
Yeah, because I hear things, how rubbish it is. I don't really know, as in the advice you get, that it doesn't work too well with wheat beer.
Oh, for wheat beer, yes, but yeah, I was going to just check in that it's specifically wheat. I always just buy fresh, just because I've heard those things. But sounds like James doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, for that Weizenbock, I think I brewed a pale Weizenbier before it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's again, I think in terms of reuse, I suspect it depends upon how much of it you're using, the pitching rate and things like that. If you're going for an entire yeast cake, that's probably going to really mute the character, particularly the banana esters, which are all from yeast growth. So yeah, I can understand that might not be great, but reusing a bit of it should be okay.
I think pitching up, making a Weiss and then a Weizenbock, fine. I think trying to keep some back, keeping that mix between the larger yeasts that are going to give it all the flavour and the finer yeasts that give it the attenuation, and gradually ending up with crystal Weizen, and that you might as well just buy it again. I think, if you're a brewery just making it over and over again, clearly they reuse it, but yeah, I'm not sure I'd recommend it. I'd just buy fresh, to be honest, depending if you're only making it once a year. I certainly wouldn't keep it for a long time.
Yeah, I would agree. Keeping it a long time difficult. But this was more a case of I will tend to beer tend to reuse yeast quite a bit. So I'll just take off slurry as it is, and then reuse it. And I just try and keep out dry hops and things like that from the slurry I'm reusing. But even then, it's not been a big issue unless it's a massive load of hops in it.
Blimey, I can't believe we talked so long. It's good when you do the presentations, James. Mine was 5 minutes long, and now we've managed to talk for an hour or something.
Cool.
It's interesting, your dark Weizenbock. I mean, you could probably replace. It'd be interesting to get to 100% wheat right now. I think
Yeah.
there's so many different. I mean, you could make anything out of just wheat malt now. It used to be just pale wheat, and now you can get all of those things in the middle. You were saying you can even get like a Vienna one. You could probably go 100% wheat with some stuff. Might be quite interesting.
Well, there are some.
Whiskey's 100%, right? So
I did find a bunch of recipes for like wheat wine and things like that. Oh no, it's in the other book. So actually, well, my other research book was the Stan Hieronymus? Yeah, Stan Hieronymus's Brewing with Wheat. And again, Dunkelweizen has about 2 sentences written on it. It's like it doesn't exist. Weizenbock has slightly more, but it's more like 7 or 8 sentences. So not massively useful. But yeah, he does have recipes for wheat wines and things like that in there, which could be interesting as well.
Dunkelhopfenweizen.
Yeah. Oh, could I make like a
on toast?
A American stout kind of thing, but with starting off with a dark Weizenbock instead.
And am I right? I mean, is it Rogan? Serge will help me. Rogan beer is
rye,
the same yeast, right? But with rye, so it's still that banana clove flavor crossover, right?
Which is why I remembered about it since the chat of the talk. Yeah, it's you basically replace your wheat base with all rye.
Yeah.
And I've had a really good example a friend brought from Germany, which used mostly rye and a mix of buckwheat in there, roasted buckwheat, and it was genuinely lovely.
But same yeast, so it's still banana clove.
Yeah, still banana clove, yeah.
With a bit of spice. Interesting. So rye might work with a lot of these, especially the darker ones, actually, to spice it up.
Yeah, it was sort of like not dark amber, but kind of veering there.
Good. Well, I mean, that was, I learned a lot, James. Thanks for team tagging that with us. I hope lots of people were inspired and make some for the next competition, and not competition, the next meeting, and bring a few bottles into swap. So
yeah.
Questions?
Well, for me, it's been like the Dunkelweizen. I keep on thinking I'm going to brew for a while, so it's actually made me go and brew it. So that'll be the next thing I do.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm going to be there for the tasting. I'm not so happy that I don't have the ability to brew it.
We're happy you can't brew it, Serge. By that silence, that says loads.
One thing I guess we're not mentioning that is headspace in your fermenter.
Yeah.
So one thing I've always found with the Weiss yeast they are massive sort of corrosion on them, like almost as much as you've got beer underneath it. They can, or at least you need like at least 50% headspace above your beer. Otherwise they blow off massively. So that's going to be a challenge because I don't have anything like that in my fermenter. So I'm going to be clearing up stuff several times probably.
Yeah, I'd be interested if you could successfully brew a Weizenbier in a pressure fermenter, but like above 30°C.
That sounds like a Richard Conroy experiment to me.
I want like our.
I've done enough experiments.
I like Steve Smith to give it a go as well.
Steve Smith, yeah.
Pressure guru.
Any questions? Anyone inspired? Anyone horrified and scared off?
Oh, sorry, did I not mute mine? I've been clanging away here.
What do you guys think about like the body? Because according to Bjcb, you can have quite a range of like fairly medium low body, medium full, etc. Like, what would you say the classics are?
I think it sort of should be medium full, really. And that's a combination of the wheat, and the body that brings, as well as the carbonation, which is very high, adds a lot of body to it. So
yeah.
so I would expect something that's quite full, not sweet, but just full.
Yeah. My
Mouth
first
filling.
ever beer brewed was a Weihenstephaner clone. That's actually like literally what got me into brewing. Yeah.
I wonder if aiming for a lower body because the carbonation's putting it up there is better though anyway. It depends how you're going to drink it, I guess, right? If you want to drink 3 or 4 pints or just have a little bit. I mean, it definitely, from the point you put it in the keg, it's fermented and it's carbonated, it goes downhill. So it is one of those ones you want to.
Yeah, you want to almost drink it while it's still fermenting.
Yeah, basically, the fresher you can get it, the better.
Yeah.
Good for a party.
Yeah.
I've got a question on that. Sorry, Joe, go on.
Would it last better if you were bottle conditioning?
Yes. Yes, definitely. Because you can,
Yeah.
because with a keg, well, the entire time everything's dropping out down to the bottom. Whereas with a bottle, you can just upend the whole thing, so you still got the whole beer in there. I mean, it's a delicate flavour as well, so it will suffer from oxidation. So you've got to be on top of your bottling quality.
Yeah, but it's not that the flavours degrade; it's that the flavours are dropping out in the keg.
No, they degrade. Wheat beers go off quick. I'd put it in a keg, but put the label on upside down, James.
I've heard of people like literally they say like they take their kegs and they just give them a little shake every now and then.
Yep, that's what I do.
To resuspend the yeast. So I mean, I think it's for me I think it's a combination of sort of aging where the flavors do dull over time, but even if you can keep them fresh, I think that the yeast drives a lot of flavor.
Wheat just goes off over time, right? A bit like hops. Yeah.
Is it question on the haziness? I mean, is it just from the yeast, or do you get some of that from the carryover from the extra protein coming off the wheat as well? It's going to give you the haziness.
I heard from Serge that it comes off the oat husks.
And if you don't use oat husk, Mark?
Yeah.
I think there probably. I think there probably is a bit of protein haze. I mean, the suggestion I've had, which I'm not going to say which brewery because if this goes on YouTube, then I don't want the club to get sued, is that there is a major brewery and they were basically using what was essentially making a chill haze permanent in their beers. So it became shelf stable haze. But traditionally, the haze came from yeast and it being unfiltered young beer. And there's definitely a lot of flavour in the yeast. So, yeah.
I just wouldn't worry if it was clear or not. Just drink it anyway.
Yeah, if it tastes good, drink it.
I think
I've brewed one in the past. You know, I failed to get like Mark. Well, I can't brew a hazy beer. So.
Good for you.
Help each other because I can't seem to brew a clear beer.
Never the twain shall meet.
There you go. Just brew Hefeweizen.
That's it.
They're refreshing, Serge.
Yeah, no, like even with gelatin, my beers don't clear. I have no idea what's going on. But I was thinking, has anybody tried to Brett a Weizenbier?
Sorry?
Has anybody tried to age Weizenbier on a Brett culture?
I'll do that for you, Serge.
Awesome.
No.
And not sour, but just Brett.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
It's yeah, I think it would have a lot of things to feed on, and it might be an interesting flavor combo, especially with the more earthy, bready flavors rather than the fruity stuff.
Great
Wheat's going to go off though. Yeah. We can try it.
You say not sour, but I've had a few attempts at doing a Berliner Weiss, which oddly enough, I think improves with age. It's only wheat beer that seems to that I've ever made.
Well, your Berliner Weiss is still the best one I've ever had. And yes, I would expect it to improve with age because of all the bacteria and, and all of the flavor development. You get a lot of flavor development in lactose, not lactose, lactobacillus-based beers over time. Like my Lichtenheiner that I left for a year was absolutely smashing a year later. And all of that actually acidic complexity and other flavors was just wow.
Right, who's going to make one then for the now after that inspiration? I'd forgotten about this one, I must admit, but we've got until, I thought it was going to be, you're going to say it's going to be for the July one, but no, August, easily enough time, isn't it?
Yeah, I said drink them young, so yeah,
and I'd imagine that
to time.
They for the beers that you've been talking about, like Hefeweizen and all that type of stuff, they sort of hit their probably hit their peak at about 3 weeks or something or less.
From brewing, yeah.
James, didn't you bring a Hefeweizen, which was like the quickest grain to glass in like 6 or whatever days?
It's like 9 days old, I think.
There you go. So you threw it a week before the.
Yeah, I think it was, I think actually it was like 10 days or something like that. So it was basically fermented in 3 or 4 days, then went into a keg, and I kept back a litre of the wort originally, which I then reboiled, dumped into the keg before transferring the finished beer, and basically let it carb up with that, and then added just a bit of CO2 on top. So yeah, you can turn it around really quickly. Again, that was a victim of the WLP 380 egginess. So maybe WLP 300 instead, or another one. But yeah, you can turn them around super quick if you can get that fermentation right.
I'm genuinely interested whether people now want to make one or now don't. Can you whip up a thing, James? Survey
of whether people want to brew it or not.
I'm just interested whether that scared people or not, to be honest. I don't know.
Do nice anonymous voting.
No, I'm really interested, but I'm just not in the UK in July, so I actually physically can't brew.
Pressure your cloudy Kona clone.
Sorry, Mark?
Putting your cloudy Kona clone with a bit of banana essence.
Yeah, I'll just stick a banana in there. And use a bit of the clove oil. That'll do.
I bet there's some cheating going on with that somehow, isn't there? There has to be, like people using liquid smoke. I'm going to mention no names.
I'm pretty sure I found the hop bit clashed with the Hopfenweizen. It wasn't my thing.
The Schneider Weiss one.
I think it was that. Like I said, it was 11 o'clock when I had the strong.
I tried one and I have wiped it from my memory. There was probably a reason for it. Even though Schneider Weiss, the original one, is probably my favorite, competing with Weihenstephaner, at least out of what I've tried. And I find that's
number 5.
Sorry?
Number 5?
I don't remember the number, but it's the Schneider Weiss Weiss beer, whichever tap number it is. And I find that craft breweries do a really shitty job of brewing them.
Yeah. Yeah, they had one at Three Hills, didn't they? Which was all right for a few mouthfuls and then didn't quite go right.
They are like American wheat beers with no hops. That's kind of where I place them mostly. Just Like every time I've had one in a pub or craft beer place or brewery, it's just not cutting it.
I mean, just the standard style, the Weissbier, when you have one that's right, you're then sold on it. But there's a lot that aren't quite there. You don't have to, you don't have to fall far off the ridge before you're not in a good place. I think when you get a really good one, then you're sold on it. A bit like the Dunkelweizen. I had plenty of them. Didn't understand them until I judged one, and it was really good. So,
All right, I'll put a link to a survey that's anonymous. So, say whether you're going to brew one or not, or whatever reason, please. And yeah, see what people say.
Yeah, I just had a thought on the pressure fermentation. If you're wanting to get these things done quick, tapped quick, if you ferment under very low pressure and then just use whatever it is, the last bit of gravity to carbonate, suddenly you're straight into keg, hazy as hell, and you're drinking beer as soon as it's cold.
Yeah, I mean that's what said, like the keeping back a liter of work from the boil, sticking in a PET bottle and stuck it in the freezer for a few days, and then I gave it a quick boil when it came out, just out of just because I felt I should. But that worked really well because the yeast was obviously, the beer was still cloudy. There was tons of yeast in there, and it just munched straight through it. So it's very quick to carbonate.
Pressure fermenting is interesting then with this style.
I wonder whether it would like suppress some of the esters, stuff like that.
Well, it would, and then that might be a way of driving up the clove without doing a ferulic acid rest and doing a single infusion, fermenting under pressure, and just getting a good balance, maybe. Yeah.
James, when you just said that you held back a litre of the wort and chucked that in to give it something to feast on and carbonate it, what size batch?
20 litres.
All right, okay. So about
I think
about 5%, yeah?
Yeah, it needed a bit more gas and stuff like that overall. So you could have gone 10% probably. But it was just kind of a quick experiment to see, and it worked really well. So
I've not heard of that. That sounds a good idea.
It's called Spiesening in German. So you've heard of Krausening, which is where you add a portion of essentially work from a subsequent batch that you then put in, that's just ready that started fermenting. Spiesening is slightly different, but you're just adding fresh work kind of thing. But yeah, it worked. Yeah,
from the same batch though. So
and much faster than, unless you sort of crank up your pressure a lot, but obviously easier to do than needing kegs and things like that generally. So you could do it in your sort of plastic keg and things like that as well if you wanted to.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Or maybe you could even dump it into a bottling bucket and then bottle from it. I mean, I think you need to work out a bit more about how much is left in there and perhaps add a bit of sugar, but it's all doable.
Yeah. I suppose in a keg, first of all, because you can control what's going on. If you have the keg, that is.
A litre of wort shouldn't have been enough to fully carbonate it up to a high level. Let's put it that way. So
yeah, so a top up with some, give it a blast of CO2, yeah?
Yeah, or a bit of extra sugar or something. But.
Right.
Just to answer your question, Lee, I'm planning a Weiss already this week, but I'm going to add a ferulic acid rest on your say-so.
Yeah.
And I'll hold you to account if it comes out shit.
Go for it.
Oh, okay.
So Lee won't turn up now.
Look at Serge. He's gone into like sex mode. Like going for the leg.
Oh,
I'll turn the camera this way, okay?
There you go, sir. That's
so that you guys don't get excited.
Oh.
Right, so we got any more people that are going to respond to this? We've got 8 responses so
I
far.
was a maybe, but you didn't have a maybe option. I'm going to try.
Aw.
I'm on
Yeah,
holiday as well, so it's
You
trying
know,
to work
you
out.
either
whether
will or you will not, right?
Yeah. I was just looking at the calendar, working out, right, if I brewed it here, I could leave it for this amount of time and on holiday and then come back and bottle it.
As it stands, we've got 8 responses and 5 people say yes, they're going to brew one.
Amazing.
One says there's not enough time, or one says they're not interested in brewing it, and one says something else. But
Yeah, there's something else was me because I'm really interested by literally thought.
cool. So we should hopefully have a few. And I mean, I was thinking, Lee, maybe we might like throw in, say, like it might anonymize them, and then throw in a couple of commercial ones, just to sort of see how people feel about them, and then we'll announce what's what at the end, maybe. But we'll talk about it separately.